So, this is a thanks for that, dude. The second question that we're looking at here, what's being revealed about his character by Pisani's incessant hand rubbing on page 17 to 18. He says here, they enter and Pisani is rubbing his hand, and they have this dialogue. Good morning, what can we do for you? Turns. The maniac says, have you hurt your hand? It's nothing. Why are you rubbing it then? To give yourself a bit of confidence. And then Pisani says, to whom do I have the pleasure? And then later on, this hand rubbing thing comes up in a much cruder fashion. The maniac, I think, accuses him of having used it for sexual purposes later on in the scene. But if he's constantly doing this, there is this suggestion of having inflicted previous violence on someone. You know, this hand rubbing that he enters the scene doing, that keeps cropping up throughout it. The maniac uses this to sort of mock him for his sad monomania and sexuality. But at this point in time, what's being suggested to us is actually that he's been inflicting police brutality on someone else somewhere. You know, he wanders in having hurt his hand, having probably punched someone or hit them around the back of the head. So there's something about Pisani that's sinister when he first of all arrives on the scene. One of the things that you'll see in this whole play, but in this scene particularly, are logical fallacies. The first appearance of them is at the top of page 17, when the maniac says, I knew a bishop once, rubbed himself like that. He was a Jesuit, of course. And then Pisani says, I may be mistaken, but he said, you are most certainly mistaken if you assume I am making any kind of allusion to the proverbial hypocrisy of the Jesuits. I may not be relevant at this precise moment, but I studied with them, you know. I take it you have no objections. So he does a number of different things here that are rhetorical trickery that shows you how he operates on a manipulative level. The first thing that he does is he creates what's called a straw man argument. A straw man argument is where you construct an imagined opposition to someone else's point. So say, you know, Sophia is saying to me, and it would be Sophia, why haven't you graded our essays, Mr. G? Where are they? And then I said something like, it would be really fantastic, Sophia, if you could turn up to class on time. What I'd be doing is constructing a different argument for you to then attach yourself onto, so that your original point of argument, it gets lost. It's a distraction tactic, a straw man argument. You invent a response that isn't really there. You invent an argument that isn't really there in order to distract someone from the real one that they're trying to have with you. And so here, when he talks here about whether the Pisani is going to be annoyed or not about his allusion to the Jesuits, he's distracting his attention from the previous insult that he's just leveled at him. You know, he insults him and suggests that he's been basically fondling himself with his sore hand, and then tries to distract him from this argument by revealing his non-point of contention with the Jesuits. So he insults him and then distracts him from his own insult that he's leveled at him. And so this is what he uses all the time. He invents arguments for them to bite onto so that they lose track of the thing that they were supposed to be talking about in the first place. You know, students are the masters of straw man discussions. You know, they invent an argument that's not really there.
How is he insulting him?
In the previous line, I'm going to have to record this, sadly. I knew a bishop once who rubbed himself like that. He was a Jesuit, of course. He's insulting him and the church all at once, simultaneously, suggesting that he's worn his hand out from, what do we call this? Obsessive self-pleasuring.
Obsessive self-pleasuring.
Onanism is the fancy name for what we're talking about here. You can Google that later on, but we're not gonna.
Yeah, no.
We're not gonna deal with this.
You never know.
Onanism. Don't Google it in school. Please. So
It's probably restricted.
this video is definitely going to get blacklisted by YouTube already. So we've already been there. It's impossible to explain the subtext of this play without saying rude stuff. But he accuses him of having worn his hand out from that, and then distracts him from that insult before he has actually time to register that he's insulted him by talking about his affiliation with the Jesuits. So he calls him a kind of pervert, basically, and then distracts him from that by talking about how he's associated with the Jesuits, who he said that he's like. It's also another rhetorical trope, which is called apophasis. Apophasis is where you bring up something by saying that you're not going to bring it up. So you say, we're not going to talk about this awful, rude, crude sexual innuendo in this line here. But of course, by me saying that, I'm bringing it up. And so here, when he says, you're certainly mistaken if you assume I am making any kind of allusion to the proverbial hypocrisy of the Jesuits. Well, that's exactly what he's talking about, but he's telling you that you're mistaken in thinking it. So it makes it sound like he's being polite, but in fact all he's doing is a sort of reverse evocation. Apophasis, A-P-O-P-H-A-S-I-S. Trump does this all the time. You'll see politicians do this all the time. Well, we're not going to talk about how da-da-da-da-da has a terrible record on X, Y, Z. Well, saying that you're not going to talk about it is talking about it. You know, and this is the classic sort of rhetorical trope of politicians who want to bring something up but think it seems kind of conniving to do it directly. So they invoke it by saying that they're not going to speak about it. It's speaking about something whilst claiming that you're not going to. This is important because what it shows us is that language itself is highly manipulative and malleable. You know, you can shape language to produce outcomes that suit you and fulfill your own interests. And the maniac just happens to be more dexterous at it than the police officers. The maniac's better at it, and luckily we side with him. But it's not, you know, beyond the imagination to see that a police officer, you know, perhaps with neo-fascist sympathies and wonderful verbal dexterity, could utilize this verbal dynamism for slightly more unsavory political ends, which is precisely what they reveal later on in the scene has occurred with the maniac. So, sorry, not with the maniac, with the anarchists. You know, they're revealed to have done this. So it gives the maniac a sense of command over the affairs of the scene. You know, he is like the orchestra conductor in this scene. He has them running around in circles, confessing things about each other, accusing each other, making insults about each other, and just sits there pleasurably absorbing it. And we see that first of all in this little passage, where he seems to be at this moment in time capable of within the second interchange with Pisani, of smoke and mirrors. He's already got him running round after his own tail. He's only spoken to him once. And so this pattern of verbal manipulation carries on throughout the scene. In what ways is the authority of Pisani corroded in the second half of page 17? Well, let's take a look at this. Maniac says, terrific, because you see this bishop to whom I was referring was an inveterate hypocrite, a liar, a cheat, and a disgusting lech, always stroking himself, just like you. Listen, and then he says to the constable again, you've got a brother who works here, and this is the guy wearing the mustache in the previous scene. So there's this ridiculous sense of this being like a kind of cheap acting company. He says, no, and then the maniac says, remind me not to appear in these cheap touring productions again. Can't even afford a decent-sized cast. And then the voice off stage says, sorry, and then actually he's supposed to say the name of the actor who's ever playing this role, this second role. And Pisani says, for Christ's sake, do you mind? And then the maniac says, sorry, it's the touring. Pisani then says, the greasy breakfasts. So they have these sort of meta-theatrical interjections in this passage here. And it's at that time that makes the police kind of complicit in his own performance. That the police are as theatrical as the maniac here. He's constantly chiseling away the sense in which the police and the reality that they're supposed to represent are reality. He's constantly trying to give us this impression that they are as theatrical and performative as the maniac himself. And these fourth wall violations, they're called, these fourth wall violations constantly give us that sense of uncertainty about where reality begins and where the performance ends. They're blurred all the time. And every time it occurs, it's a political point. Because Pisani starts off here being annoyed about these interjections, and then one exchange later, he's actually joining in with them. He's like, oh, it's the greasy breakfast I have to eat while I'm on tour in the theatrical production. He starts talking as an actor here. And then the maniac says, the nylon sheets, implying that Pisani wets the bed. And it's a play on his name, I think. Pisani. He's accusing him of wetting the bed, and that's why he mentions nylon sheets, I think. He says, where were we? This continuous massaging, yes, undoubtedly a symptom of insecurity. He's talking about his hand again. Problems with Marta in your formative years, I expect. You should screw more, unleash yourself. And Pisani then says, will you tell me once and for all to whom I have the dubious pleasure of speaking? And so whilst he's insulting him for having problems in his formative years with his mum and sexuality, then he introduces himself as, I am Professor Marco Maria Malipiero, first counsellor to the High Court. And the constable then gets his hand caught in the filing cabinet as this occurs. But this is a really kind of powerful example of dramatic irony here, because we're fully aware of the ridiculous facade that the maniac's identity is based upon at this point. It's a complete sham like all of his other ones have been. But we've seen him not only appear in this costume, but we've seen him put it on. We've seen him practice his lines. We've seen all of the rehearsal that goes into this performance. And so the police are in this position of ridiculous dramatic irony where they have no idea, and everyone has not only an idea, but has seen all of the background to this dramatic irony. The fact that the constable then gets his hand caught in the filing cabinet, these sort of farcical moments of slapstick that punctuate the action, are always telling in some way. The panic that you can see in that stage action, because he's mentioned that he's a counsellor to the High Court and that he's a magistrate. He's basically heard that, the constable, and crapped himself. Like, oh God, he's a judge, we're in trouble. And Pisani then, immediately, heart attack coming on. It takes him one line, takes him to tell him with one line who he is, and then, my God, the judge, he's already terrified. So in the space of one line, he's mocked him for kind of having a self-pleasuring fetish, and then the next line is telling them that he's a High Court judge and that Pisani's on the brink of kind of a nervous breakdown. And so you see their fear and the sense in which they're being caught by justice right from the word go in this scene. And so Pisani seems, both an actor, a nervous, sort of anxious individual, and then fearful of the judge, all in the space of half a page of the text. So his authority as a police officer, an influential police officer, is deeply corroded by all of those things that are occurring on the bottom half of 17. Number 5 says, how does the action with the maniac's coat at the top of page 18 make an ironic point about the stupidity of the police? This is one of my favourite bits in the whole scene. So Maniac says, formerly lecturer at the University of Rome with 2 commas and a full stop in the normal way. And then Pisani says, we didn't expect to see you so soon. Says their expectation of guilt is evident in that line, that they are in some way anticipating a visit from the judge. Maniac says, precisely. We decided to catch you on the hop. Does that put you out? And then Pisani's offended by this, struggles to regain his composure. Not at all. And then the constable says, please sit down, let me take your coat. And then the maniac says, you might as well, it's not mine anyway. Do you remember where this coat comes from? Yeah, he steals it off of Bertozzo in the first scene and wears it because he thinks it looks like a judge's coat. So there's so many layers of farce in this that he's wearing one of their colleagues' coats. He then tells them that it's not his, and they still don't recognize that he's performing. It's supposed to all feed into this ludicrous naivety that they seem to have in the face of this High Court judge who they're all terrified. So you see all these tricky things going on with props and costumes in Dario Fo's plays that are always contributing to this corrosion of the boundaries between theatre and reality. And in this play are making a really kind of fearsome, angry point about the farcical nature of political reality. The maniac then says, "You might as well, it's not mine. Please call the superintendent. I'd like to begin right away." He hangs his coat and hat on the coat stand. "Perhaps we should go into his office. It's more comfortable." "But isn't this the room where the dirty business with the anarchists took place?" And then Pisani says, "Yes, in here." And he hangs himself already. He fails to recognise the implications of the question that the maniac asks. He calls it the dirty business with the anarchists. And he just responds frankly to that question, not realising that it's kind of entrapping him, admitting that it was dirty business. Pisani sort of does that, thinking that they're talking about the fact that it's unsavoury in some way, but obviously it makes it sound like their own involvement in this was highly sinister. The last question that I wanted to talk to you about before I ask you to have a look at some of this yourself is why are the superintendent's efforts to conceal the clandestine nature of their interrogation practices ironic? The clandestine basically means secretive and sort of morally questionable. The wrong thing in secret, basically. So if we look at the rest of this passage, there's a huge layer of irony in this. The maniac says, Pisani says, "Ask the superintendent to step in here as quickly as possible if he can." Maniac says, "Even if he can't." Pisani says, "Yes, even if he can't." Constable, "Yes, sir." This is ridiculous because it shows you that it's nonsensical. Step in even if he can't. And then Pisani says, "I'll give that bastard Bertozzo a call to bring up the files. No doubt you want a transcript of the interrogation." "No, that won't be necessary. I've got everything right here." Oh, the maniac gets the documents out of the bags, and the constable and the superintendent enter. And the superintendent's furious. He says, "Do you know who I've got there?" And he's in shirt sleeves, sleeves rolled up, carrying a rubber blackjack, very sweaty. And the superintendent then says, "Only bloody Bruno, the Olivetti kidnapper. Only about to crack him, wasn't I? And you send your clod-hopping lackey stomping in and screw everything up completely." So the superintendent here is the highest police official that is involved in this crisis. He's a sort of government representative of the police. Pisani then says, "I apologise, but listen." And the superintendent says, "Then I passed poor old Bertozzo on his way to the medical room with a face like some inflatable fruit and learned that you thumped him." Pisani says, "He blew a raspberry at me. He went like this," which is why I punched him in the face. "Raspberry looked more like a prize marrow to me. What did you use? A fucking flagpole? Old Bruno in there looks pristine by comparison." Pisani is trying to get a word in. "A fine time to start cracking up. Perhaps you don't realise, but there are eyes watching us, press hounds snapping at our heels, waiting for us to slip. Just once so they can pounce. We must keep our heads." The maniac draws the superintendent aside. And he says, "I share your anxiety, superintendent." And then the superintendent says, "Who the blazes is this? I have had cause myself to severely reprimand this young associate of yours. I've noticed he is somewhat repressed, appears to be on the verge of a sexual crisis. Wanking himself stupid, I shouldn't wonder. He would benefit greatly from the guidance of an understanding father substitute," and gives him his visiting card. The maniac just says, "Try this man. Fees are a bit steep, but he's a genius with arrested adolescents." So there's all kinds of comic sort of dynamism going on in this scene. The most important of which is that the superintendent inadvertently reveals the nature of the brutality that they seem to habitually carry out in custody here, by talking about Bertozzo and the way that he looks clearly like he's been beaten up and that it's Pisani that's done it. First of all, he seems farcical when he says that he punched him in the face because he blew a raspberry at him. It's utterly trivial and childish. But in this passage here, what we realise is that he's implicitly drawing attention to their tactics of interrogation that are what people were accusing them of doing against the maniac. Against the anarchist. Looked more like a prize marrow to me. What did you use? A fucking flagpole. Old Bruno in there looks pristine by comparison. So he's drawing attention to the extreme nature of the violence that Pisani has inflicted on Bertozzo. But by doing so, has sort of revealed indirectly that it's a habitual thing for the police to do, to beat the hell out of their suspects. And so it inadvertently reveals the brutality of their sort of tactics. And that's why Pisani is then trying to stop him from speaking, so that who they think is the judge can't hear them saying these terrible things about their interrogation tactics. So he's here trying to hide the truth of the brutality. So you can see already that they're giving away all sorts of clandestine details about the way they handle suspects and trying to cover them up, which is precisely what Foe wants us to see, is the way that they are trying to cover up and formulate different versions of the truth, because that's precisely what he's trying to unravel regarding the anarchist. And then the superintendent says, it's a fine time to start cracking up. Perhaps you don't realize, but there are eyes watching us. Press hounds snapping at our heels, waiting for us to slip so they can pounce. We must keep our heads. Well, the great irony here is that he's giving away the truth whilst trying to conceal it, and that the people that he says are the eyes are watching us are already in the room with him. The maniac posing as the judge are the eyes that are watching them, and he's already there in the room, and he doesn't realize. That's when you know you've done too many screencasts. Your startup disk is full. So all of these sort of opening passages are designed to give us this sense of complete, or to destabilize our sense of trust in the authority of the police and to trust in what they do and say. We have this immediate sense of them both being brutal, being liars, being childish, being violent, and consciously attempting to shroud the truth in what they're doing. You know, they're coming up with versions of their reality and then formulating different farcical, theatrical versions of it to use to shroud or hide that. And so that gives us this real sense of just everything being destabilized, and that the truth itself being this sort of malleable concept that can be rewritten and overlaid in layers of meaning. And so we don't really know who to believe here, because if you think about what's going on, the exposure of the truth is being carried out by someone pretending to be a judge. So his own exposure of the truth is based on his own performative lie. And so truth itself is nowhere in the scene. You know, the truth of the reality of the anarchist might get exposed, but by exactly the kind of clandestine interrogation methods that the police are guilty of carrying out. You know, the maniac is guilty of entrapment here and fraud in order to extract the truth from the police. So there's this, where truth is located in this scene, none of us will ever know. Now, what I want you to try and do is have a look at one of these passages yourselves. We've got exactly the right number. A, B, C, D, E. They're just pairs of pages from the following part of that bit of text, which would also then give me a chance to